Hello friends, for today's video I want to go through my top 5 favorite fantasy standalones. Recently I did a similar style video where I went through my favorite completed fantasy series, and I specifically highlighted completed series as there is of course something very special about being able to see an author's vision to the end, being able to see the character arcs, all of the foreshadowing, some of which you didn't even realize was foreshadowing until you actually got the reveals and the payoffs later on in the series. There are so many aspects of completing a story and how it sits with you that I think is really meaningful, and I actually found that standalones, of course, are doing something similar just within a shorter amount of time, so I thought this would be a good companion video to my favorite completed series. If you're interested in that video, I'll have it linked. Kicking the list off, we have the Goblin Emperor. This is one that I think defies a lot of expectations for the fantasy standalone, and not necessarily in a way that makes it the easiest to recommend, as when I say that it goes against a lot of what we expect with standalones, what I mean is that standalones, I would say more often than not, are a little bit easier to get into, especially if you're newer to fantasy. It can be very daunting to see some of these series that not only are they long in the amount of installments, but each individual book is really long, and that can just feel so overwhelming. So sometimes standalones feel a little more approachable, and additionally, you expect it to be more contained, and thus is not as much of an undertaking. However, the Goblin Emperor really just throws you in, and it throws you into a world that is so extreme with the fantasy names. Anybody that's read The Goblin Emperor probably can attest to this, and I will add, for anybody that's an audiobook listener, I feel that the narrator deserved an award for being able to say all of the various different fantasy names within this. However, the story at its core is something that is relatively familiar, and I do think that all of those aspects to the story that feel somewhat convoluted and difficult to get through actually enhance what the plot of the book is, which, if you don't know, we follow a young man named Maya who has recently realized that after pretty much everybody else in line for the throne before him has been killed in some horrible accident, Maya now finds himself to be the ruler of his land. And this is something that not only did he ever expect to happen, he never thought it would, but he is somebody who has the odds stacked against him, as first off, the thing that killed off everybody else, it is unclear whether that was just a horrible accident or if there was somebody who was intending to kill all of these people. So now there's basically a murder mystery afoot. Additionally, he is somebody who, as the title would tell you, he is half goblin, and this was to try and ensure there was this alliance between the people of his land and the land that his mother came from, who was a goblin, and this actually was only really done so that there would be sort of this peace between these two lands. However, goblins are very much looked down upon within his society, so he has that working against him as well. He feels so incredibly lonely, a fish out of water. He did not grow up in court, and it feels like there's vultures around every single corner. If you like political intrigue, this is a must, essentially, recommendation, because it does political intrigue so well. And while I do, of course, appreciate in stories when we explore morally gray characters, which we will get to some even on this list that definitely have that, if not morally gray, then potentially even villainous in nature. While I do love stories that explore human beings in all their shades of gray, it is rather refreshing to read from a perspective of a character who, despite the fact that they suddenly find themselves having so much power, they are working to maintain their goodness at the end of the day. They are somebody that you just find yourself consistently rooting for. The way, though, that I find that the convoluted nature actually ties to the plot is, given Maya is such a fish out of water, he doesn't know who is who and what's what. I think that the reader feels that too. So when you have all these fantasy names thrown at you, you have all these different character names thrown at you, you're trying to pick up who's who and why do they want what they want, and are they being genuine, are they being disingenuous, and who actually has Maya's best interests at heart and who's just trying to deceive him. Because of all of that thrown at Maya, you feel that too, so you feel like you're on the edge of your seat alongside him, which, as I stated, I feel like that really enhanced the experience overall. If you're looking for a rootable character, political fantasy, and you really feel like this is just a piece, you're barely scratching the surface of a very, very fully realized world, I absolutely recommend The Goblin Emperor. Next up, we have one that perfectly captures what I was saying about characters that are borderline villainous or gray in nature, and that would be Best Served Cold by Abercrombie. We have a return of an author who had one of their works listed as a favorite completed series, and they have one of my favorite standalones as well. Best Served Cold for me was when I really felt like, okay, this is me falling in love with the First Law world. Not that I didn't enjoy the First Law trilogy, but I just kept feeling like there was more. And I knew there was more, of course, when I got into it, as there already were works written that were standalones that came after, and then Age of Madness. But I just felt like I hadn't gotten enough just yet. And I really feel like Best Served Cold, at the time that I read it, felt like the best version of Abercrombie that I had gotten. And then, of course, I have fallen head over heels with Age of Madness, and now I want to reread First Law, and I kind of feel like this is an experience a lot of Abercrombie fans go through. But regardless, Best Served Cold is a classic revenge story, which doesn't necessarily always interest me, as it's very difficult to break out of the familiar tropes that we see so often in revenge fantasy, or just revenge stories overall. And what Abercrombie does so well is he's so familiar with the tropes that when he embraces them in a way where it still feels so compulsively readable and entertaining, but then oftentimes he also knows how to subvert your expectations so that you are constantly finding yourself wanting to turn the page, because he's not going to do everything to a T, which I really found was the case with Best Served Cold. You follow a character who was betrayed by somebody that they thought was an ally, and they ended up losing somebody very close to them as a result. They are believed to be dead, which they see as the perfect opportunity to try and gain power, establish themselves, hire some people to join them, and then get their revenge. And along the way, you're not only getting to know this character more, but some of the other characters. You are also starting to discover a few additional details about this character that make you really question if you want to root for them, and the age-old question of, is revenge really worth it? Are you actually going to lose yourself and become the villain along the way? Something that Abercrombie doesn't hide is that none of his characters are particularly good for the most part, or very few of them are, and the character in this is no exception. You absolutely see that she is rough around the edges, and the other characters and how they all come together, you could say, has a feeling of a merry band of misfits, except for that to the extreme, and the way that they kind of all bounce off of each other, and nobody really cares about each other. This is not a situation where there's found family along the way. It's not one of those situations. It's kind of wondering, are they all going to kill each other? I don't know. But it is, as always, in my opinion, exceptional, as I think Abercrombie is absolutely fantastic when it comes to doing the things that we love in fantasy, but doing them in a way that feels fresh and original. Next up, we have the book that borderline inspired me to do an updated version of this, alongside, of course, the fact that I did an updated version of my favorite completed series, and that would be Blood over Bright Haven. I'm going to go ahead and let you know that one of the other entries on this list would also be by the same author, which would be Sword of Kaigen. I'll go ahead and talk about these two together, as one, I've talked about them a lot over the years. Blood over Bright Haven I've talked about quite a bit recently, as I only just read it recently, and additionally it has launched itself into being a booktube darling very quickly, so if you've not heard about it from me, I'm sure you've heard about it from other people. But what this author does so incredibly well, this is true for both works, which is why I wanted to put them together. One, the author manages to explore complex themes in a way where it does not feel at all like the standalone structure is only allowing us to scratch the surface of these themes. Somehow she manages to really dig deep and look at this from so many different angles. And on top of that, the way that the themes really play a role, not just in society, but the characters' lives, you feel it alongside them, and it feels very true to what these things would be like and are like in our own world. Within Sword of Kaigen, you are looking at propaganda and how that influences the fear that people have within them, how much they fear for their loved ones, and you really feel this specifically with the main character and her son, who both have perspectives in the story. She is somebody who, you get flashback sequences that feel really out of pocket for a while, and then how it all kind of comes together makes a lot more sense. But you see somebody who in their youth they really did push back in a lot of ways, or in ways that they could. Sometimes those ways were really almost bombastic in nature, and other times they were quieter. But the more that they grew, the more that they kind of found themselves going inward, especially to protect their family, because they realized, I don't just live for myself anymore, I live for my children as well, and I do not want to rebel against a system that might punish my children for my actions. But the main character is finding themselves really moved and feeling almost empowered and proud of their son when he is starting to question and when he is starting to do little things that maybe push back against the status quo. However, this also fills the main character with dread, as they very much fear for what could potentially happen to their son, even though there's a part of them that wants to stoke the fire within their child. Within Blood Over Brighthaven, while propaganda does play a role in the story, it sort of ties into this story a little differently. It's more about the ways that institutions want to maintain power by creating a narrative that's very tied to religion, that teaches you, yeah, you can question, but we're going to provide you with answers to try and reinforce the things that you're already being told. And so there's kind of always, if you start to turn one direction, there's almost like a wall there so that you never really get to escape and know the truth. And part of the journey of that story is you as the reader, as well as the main character, are discovering what the truth is. And the setup is that you have this particular area that is protected by this magical barrier. This entire city is protected by this magical barrier that is able to keep the citizens safe from something known as the Blight. The Blight strikes at random, and it basically disintegrates anything that it touches, which can include animals, plant life, and even humans. So there are so many people that live on the outside trying to get in, and those individuals, if they do manage to get into this city, are definitely not treated as equal citizens. Our main character is somebody who was born within the city, and as she is pushing back against a lot of the very restrictive roles that their society places on her, while she is pushing back against those things, she is also recognizing, or starting to recognize, the differences between her life and another character who was born outside of the city. So that just kind of scratches the surface for both of those stories. Both are absolutely incredible. Both pack a punch. I definitely think Sword of Kaigen packs more of an emotional punch, and I think thematically Blood Over Brighthaven was exceptionally polished, and it may have done more things, I would say, within it. It doesn't necessarily have the familial drama quite to the degree that Sword of Kaigen did, but Sword of Kaigen did have an interesting situation, and I do want to make clear, in case anybody does pick it up who hasn't yet, that Sword of Kaigen was originally going to somewhat be a book that was a companion to a series the author was working on. So there are some pieces of the story that don't necessarily feel like they fit within that book, and they feel like they belong to something else. And the author has since somewhat done something different than what they were originally planning. So you just kind of have to go in knowing there's going to be a few aspects of Sword of Kaigen that feel a little out of place. But regardless, I still feel like what they established within both of these works was absolutely exceptional, and really striking that they were able to do this and accomplish this 2 different times in 2 remarkable stories. Last for our top 5 is a book that I always question whether I think that this should be included within fantasy. Even though there absolutely are fantastical elements, it does lean into magical realism, which in my mind, I associate more with general fiction, because I feel like there is this element of none of this is really happening, and it's all potentially within the child's imagination. So does that really make it fantasy? But it's such an integral part of the plot and the story and the way that the themes are explored that I still felt like, okay, well, we're using fantasy elements as a vehicle to tell this child's story, and thus I feel like it does count, and that book would be The Kingdom of Back. I do feel like, though, that what I just described as, like, I'm not really sure how to categorize this is something that I feel likely a lot of individuals will also resonate with if they choose to pick it up, and I think it was almost difficult to market, if not mismarketed. The setup for this story is that you follow Nannerl Mozart, who was a real person in history. They were the sister to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, which is the name most of us are familiar with, and a lot of people sadly don't realize that not only did Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart have a sister, but his sister was just as talented as him, if not more so, and also within music. However, given the restrictions at that time when it came to women and their ability to pursue careers in music or just pursue certain passions at all. It didn't even have to be as a career. Because of those restrictions, that is why so many people are very unfamiliar with Nannerl Mozart. So what Marie Lu did within this story is she took this thing that was known to be real, which is when the Mozart siblings were traveling, they had this imaginary land that they were the king and queen of, known as the Kingdom of Bach. And it was this make-believe story that they would allow themselves to drift away into to entertain themselves during these travels. So Marie Lu took that concept and explored it in a way that borderline feels almost like a portal fantasy. And at first, there's almost this Narnia-esque nature to it where it just feels whimsical. It feels like this nice, fun escape. But then the more the story progresses, the more sinister the Kingdom of Bach becomes. And it matches and parallels really well with the character aging up and going from a child to adulthood and starting to have this realization of how restrictive their society is. And there's also a lot of themes when it comes to wanting to be remembered, wanting your art to exist within the world and to be heard and to be appreciated. And those themes are exceptionally heartbreaking when you know for a fact that this individual was forgotten by so many, when right next to her, her brother is being praised and lifted up. It's really devastating, but it's really, really well done. I do think, though, that if you go into it just expecting it to be this whimsical fairy tale-like story, that it doesn't really capture what the book is actually trying to do, or at least in my opinion, what it's trying to do. But I think if you have more of that awareness of, okay, this is going to be a little in the character's head, and it's more so going to be a thematic device, I think that that is going to hopefully help with your expectations if you've not picked it up, which I absolutely recommend that you do. I think it's incredible. But that's it for some of my favorite standalones. If you are looking for more videos where I talk about other fantasy standalones, I'll have those linked, as well as the one where I go through my absolute favorite completed fantasy series. Feel free to elaborate on any of the ones I mentioned, or if you have recommendations based off of these, feel free to let me know those as well. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.